You've just left the only relationship you've known for 5 years. Your savings account shows a number that makes your stomach turn. And you're sitting in a real estate office in Kawasaki, staring at apartment listings that all cost more than half your monthly salary. But then the agent slides one more paper across the desk. The rent is impossibly low, too low, the kind of low that should make you ask questions. But when you're desperate, when you need somewhere to sleep tonight, you don't ask questions, you just sign. This is exactly what happened to Mei Kobayashi on a rainy Thursday afternoon in March. She was 29, worked at a small design company in Tokyo, and had just made the kind of life decision that leaves you with nowhere to go but forward. The breakup had been sudden, not dramatic, just final. 5 years of shared routines, shared dreams, shared rent, gone in a single conversation that lasted less than 10 minutes. By evening, she was packing her life into cardboard boxes, trying to figure out how someone rebuilds from nothing with a bank account that had exactly enough money for a security deposit and maybe 2 months of groceries. The apartment was in an old building on a narrow street where the houses pressed so close together you could reach across and touch your neighbor's window. The real estate agent had driven her there in a small car that smelled like cigarettes and apologized twice for the neighborhood. But Mei wasn't looking for luxury, she was looking for survival. The building was narrow, squeezed between a laundromat and a convenience store that looked like it hadn't updated its inventory since the 90s. The hallways were dim, lit by fluorescent bulbs that hummed with an electrical buzz that made her teeth ache. The elevator was broken, had been for months according to the handwritten sign taped to its doors. Her unit was on the 2nd floor. Room 2A. A single room with a tiny kitchenette, a bathroom so small she had to back out to close the door, and one window that faced directly into the window of the building next door. The walls were thin enough that she could hear her upstairs neighbor's television through the ceiling. The tatami mats were old, carrying that musty smell that speaks of decades of other people's lives, but it was hers. For the first time in 5 years, she had a space that belonged only to her. Moving in took exactly 3 hours. Everything she owned fit into 7 cardboard boxes and 2 suitcases. The furniture that came with the apartment was minimal, but functional. A low table, a small refrigerator, a futon that folded against the wall during the day. She arranged her few belongings carefully, trying to make the space feel less like a temporary shelter and more like a home. Her books went on the single shelf, her clothes in the narrow closet, her laptop on the table near the window, where the light was best during the day. The building was quiet in a way that felt almost unnatural. She could hear the convenience store's automatic doors chiming below, the occasional footstep in the hallway, but mostly it was just the kind of deep silence that makes you aware of your own breathing. The other tenants seemed to keep to themselves. She'd glimpsed an elderly woman on the 1st floor, heard what sounded like a family with children somewhere above, but no one had introduced themselves. In Tokyo, this wasn't unusual. Privacy was a form of politeness. Her daily routine established itself quickly. Up at 6, dressed and out the door by 7, for the long commute to her office in Shibuya. The train was crowded, expensive, and took nearly an hour each way. But work was work, and her small salary as a junior designer was barely enough to cover rent, transportation, and food. She ate convenience store meals most nights, saved money by walking instead of taking taxis, and learned to find comfort in the simple routine of coming home to a space that was entirely her own. For the first week, everything was perfectly ordinary. The apartment was cheap because it was old, small, and located in a neighborhood that most young professionals avoided. The walls were thin because the building had been constructed decades ago when soundproofing wasn't a priority. The hallways were dim because the landlord was saving money on electricity. Everything had a logical explanation, and Mei was too exhausted from adjusting to her new life to look for problems that didn't exist. But on her 8th night in the apartment, at exactly 2:41 in the morning, something changed. She was lying on her futon, halfway between sleep and wakefulness, when she heard it. 3 soft knocks coming from inside her bedroom wall, not from the hallway, not from the apartment next door, but from inside the wall itself. The sound was muffled but distinct, like someone tapping gently with their knuckles against the other side of the drywall. Knock, 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 then silence. Mei sat up, her heart suddenly beating faster. She stared at the wall in the darkness, waiting for the sound to repeat. But nothing came, just the familiar hum of the refrigerator in the kitchenette and the distant sound of traffic from the main road. She lay back down, convincing herself it had been her upstairs neighbor dropping something. Or maybe the building's old pipes expanding and contracting with temperature changes. Old buildings made strange noises. Everyone knew that. The next morning, she mentioned it casually to the elderly woman she'd seen in the lobby. The woman was checking her mail, moving slowly, with the careful deliberation of someone whose bones had begun to betray them. Mei introduced herself, explained she was new to 2A, and asked if the building's walls were particularly thin. The woman looked at her with eyes that seemed to hold more knowledge than she was willing to share. "The walls are thin everywhere in this building," she said, "but 2B has been empty for years now, under renovation, they say. Nobody lives there anymore." Mei felt something cold settle in her stomach. The knocking had come from the wall that separated her apartment from 2B. If no one lived there, if it was empty and under renovation, then what had made that sound? That evening, she found herself staring at the wall as she ate her dinner of convenience store sushi. The wallpaper was old, a faded floral pattern that had probably been cheerful once, but now looked tired and yellow under the apartment's harsh lighting. She pressed her ear against it and heard nothing, just the hollow sound of empty space beyond. The second night, it happened again. Same time. 2:41 exactly, but this time there were 4 knocks instead of 3. Knock, 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 and then, after a pause that made her hold her breath, a 4th knock that seemed heavier, more deliberate. The small cup of water on her bedside table trembled slightly when the final knock came, sending tiny ripples across the surface. Mei sat up immediately, her skin covered in goosebumps despite the apartment's stuffy air. This time, she was sure she could feel a cold draft coming from somewhere near the wall, not from the window, which was closed and locked, but from the wall itself, as if something on the other side was breathing. The other side was breathing. She pulled out her phone and opened the voice recording app, holding it close to the wall. If something was making these sounds, if she wasn't losing her mind, then maybe she could capture proof. The apartment was completely silent, except for the soft hum of electronics and the distant rumble of late-night traffic. She pressed record and waited. At 2:41 exactly, the knocking came. This time it was different. 5 deliberate knocks, each one seeming to travel slightly along the wall, as if whatever was making the sound was moving. The phone's screen showed audio levels spiking with each impact. Mei felt vindicated. She had proof now, evidence that she wasn't imagining things. But when she played back the recording, her relief turned to something much colder. The knocks were there, clearly audible, but underneath them, barely perceptible, was something else, a voice so faint she had to strain to hear it, whispering words she couldn't quite make out. And beneath that, a sound like fingernails dragging slowly across wood. She listened to the recording 15 times that night, each playback revealing new layers of sound that shouldn't have been there. By morning, she was convinced she could hear her own name being whispered somewhere in the static, between the knocks. The third night, Mei decided to test something. When the knocking began its usual pattern, she knocked back. 3 soft taps against the wall with her knuckles, the response was immediate. 3 knocks from inside, perfectly mimicking her rhythm. She tried again, this time with a different pattern. 2 quick knocks, then 1 slow one. The wall responded with the exact same sequence, but delayed by several seconds, as if whatever was making the sound needed time to process and copy her movements. Her hands were shaking as she tried one more test. She knocked out the rhythm of her heartbeat, fast and irregular from fear. After a long pause, the wall knocked back with the same erratic pattern, but slower, as if her pulse was being played back at half speed. That's when she noticed the wallpaper was behaving strangely. Near where the knocking originated, the faded floral pattern seemed to bulge slightly outward, as if pressure was being applied from behind. She reached out to touch it and felt the paper give way under her finger, soft and damp despite the apartment's dry air. When she pulled her hand back, there was a clear indentation where something on the other side had pressed against her touch. The 4th night brought no knocking at all. Instead, Mei woke to find her small bedside table had been moved several inches away from the wall. She was certain she hadn't touched it before going to sleep. The dust pattern on the floor clearly showed where it had been and where it now sat, but more disturbing was what she found when she moved it back. The wall behind where the table had stood showed fresh scratch marks, thin lines gouged into the surface as if someone had been clawing at it from the inside. By the 5th night, the sounds had evolved into something that made her stomach clench with dread. The knocking had become a slow, rhythmic tapping that seemed to circle the entire perimeter of her room, moving along all 4 walls like something was walking around the inside of the structure itself. She could track its movement by following the sound as it traveled from the shared wall with 2B, along the exterior wall, across the wall that bordered the hallway, and back again. Sleep became impossible. Mei found herself sitting upright on her futon, fully dressed, staring at the walls and waiting for the sounds to begin. She started leaving lights on throughout the night, but even the harsh fluorescent bulb couldn't make the apartment feel safe. If anything, the bright light made the shadows cast by the bulging wallpaper seem deeper and more menacing. On Saturday morning, she made a decision that felt both brave and foolish. She was going to confront her landlord directly about the situation. In 2B. The property management office was a small, cluttered space above a ramen shop, reached by a narrow staircase that creaked under her weight. The landlord, Mr. Tanaka, was a thin man in his 60s who looked like he'd spent years dealing with tenant complaints he'd rather ignore. When Mei explained what she'd been hearing, his expression shifted from polite attention to something that looked almost like fear. Unit 2B has been sealed for 6 years, he said, his voice carefully controlled. The last tenant left very suddenly. Since then, we've had difficulty with that space. Contractors won't finish the renovation work. They claim the walls sound hollow when they shouldn't, and the electrical systems behave strangely. We've had 3 different companies refuse to complete the job. Mei pressed him for more details. What had happened to the previous tenant? Why had they left so suddenly? Mr. Tanaka's answers became increasingly vague, but eventually he admitted that the tenant had simply vanished one day. Their belongings were still in the apartment, rent was paid through the month, but they never came home from work. The police investigated but found no signs of foul play. Sometimes buildings hold on to things, he said finally, looking out the window rather than at her. Old places like this, they remember the people who lived there. Usually it's harmless, just sounds, nothing more. But if you're having trouble sleeping, I can show you some other units. Mei left the office with more questions than answers, and a growing certainty that she couldn't afford to move again so soon. Her savings were depleted, her security deposit locked up for months, and finding another affordable place in Tokyo was nearly impossible. She was trapped in 2A, at least for now. That evening, she sent a text message to Kenji, her closest co-worker at the design company. They'd gone for drinks occasionally, and he was one of the few people who might believe her story without thinking she was having some kind of breakdown. "I know this sounds crazy," she typed, "but I think there's something wrong with my apartment. The knocking is getting louder every night, and I found scratch marks on my wall this morning. I think someone or something is inside the wall between my unit and the empty one next door. If you don't hear from me, check apartment 2A at the address I gave you last week." She hesitated before sending it, knowing how paranoid it sounded, but the alternative was facing whatever was happening completely alone, and that felt more dangerous than seeming unstable to a colleague. Kenji's response came quickly. "Are you okay? Do you want to stay at my place tonight? This doesn't sound safe." But Mei had already made her decision. She was going to face whatever was in that wall. She was going to record everything, document every sound, every movement, every strange occurrence. If something happened to her, at least there would be evidence. At least someone would know she hadn't just imagined it all. As darkness settled over Kawasaki and the narrow streets grew quiet, Mei sat on her futon with her phone fully charged, the voice recording app open and ready. She had positioned a small digital camera on her table, aimed at the wall where the sounds originated. Whatever was going to happen tonight, she would be ready for it. The clock on her phone showed 2:40 a.m. when she heard the first sound. But this time, it wasn't knocking. This time, it was her name being whispered from inside the wall, clear and unmistakable, in a voice that sounded disturbingly like her own, Mei. The whisper came from directly behind where she was sitting, as if someone was pressed against the other side of the wall, just inches from her back. She spun around, her phone still recording, and stared at the faded floral wallpaper. The voice had been crystal clear, unmistakably her own name, spoken in a tone that carried both longing and desperation. She rewound the recording and played it back. There it was again, but this time she could hear layers beneath the whisper, a scratching sound like fingernails dragging across wood, a soft thudding, rhythmic and steady, like a heartbeat. And underneath everything, so faint she had to strain to catch it, what sounded like crying. Mei set the phone down with trembling hands and approached the wall. The bulge in the wallpaper had grown larger since she'd first noticed it, now roughly the size of her palm. The paper felt warm and slightly damp when she touched it, and she could swear she felt movement beneath the surface, like something shifting just out of reach. "Who are you?" she whispered to the wall. The response was immediate. 3 slow knocks, then her name again, clearer this time. "Mei, help me." The voice was definitely hers, but wrong somehow, like a recording played back at the wrong speed, or words spoken by someone who had learned her voice but couldn't quite capture its natural rhythm. She pressed her ear against the warm spot on the wall and heard breathing that didn't match her own, slow, labored breaths that seemed to be coming from very far away. Over the next hour, she tried to establish some kind of communication. She would ask questions, and the knocking would respond in patterns that almost made sense. 1 knock for yes, 2 for no. But when she asked if someone was trapped, the wall went silent for long minutes before erupting in frantic scratching that seemed to circle the entire room. By dawn, Mei had filled her phone's memory with recordings, hours of audio that captured whispers in her voice, scratching sounds that formed no pattern she could understand, and what increasingly sounded like sobbing coming from deep inside the building's structure. When she played the files back through headphones, she could make out words hidden in the static. Cold, dark, can't leave, and repeatedly, desperately, help me. She called in sick to work and spent the day researching the building's history at the local library. The records were sparse, but she found references to construction problems dating back to the building's completion in 1987. Multiple contractors had abandoned renovation projects, citing structural irregularities and acoustic anomalies. One report mentioned that workers complained of hearing voices in the walls, but the building inspector had found no evidence of radio interference or neighboring units. The most disturbing discovery was a missing person report from 6 years ago. Hiroshi Yamada, age 31, had been the last tenant in Unit 2B. He worked at an electronics store and lived alone. His employer reported him missing when he failed to show up for work 3 days in a row. Police found his apartment locked from the inside, his belongings untouched, no signs of struggle. The case remained open but inactive. The photograph in the file showed a thin man with kind eyes and a nervous smile. Looking at his face, Mei felt a chill of recognition. She had seen those eyes before, reflected in her own mirror during the long, sleepless nights since the knocking began. That evening she made a decision that felt both necessary and terrifying. She was going to try to help whoever or whatever was trapped in that wall. If Hiroshi Yamada was somehow still there, still conscious after 6 years, then he needed someone to know what had happened to him. She positioned her camera to record everything and sat cross-legged on her futon, facing the wall. "Hiroshi?" she called softly. "Is that your name? Are you Hiroshi Yamada?" The knocking that came in response was frantic, joyful almost, a rapid series of taps that seemed to dance across the wall's surface. Then her voice whispered back, but this time with a different cadence, a masculine inflection that made her skin crawl. "Yes, Hiroshi. So long, so cold. How did you get inside the wall?" The scratching that followed was violent enough to make dust fall from the ceiling. When it stopped, the voice came again, strained and distant. Fell through, can't get back." Mei tried to understand. Had he somehow fallen into a gap between the walls? Was there a structural defect, a space where someone could become trapped? But that didn't explain how he could have survived for 6 years, or how his voice could emerge from her throat when she played back the recordings. "Are you hurt? Are you hungry?" "Not hungry, not thirsty, not alive, not dead, stuck between." The words sent ice through her veins. She looked at the bulge in the wallpaper, now pulsing slightly, like something breathing. The warm dampness had spread, creating a dark stain that resembled the outline of a human hand pressed against the other side. "How can I help you?" The wall fell silent for so long that Mei began to think the conversation was over. Then, very quietly, her own voice whispered back with words that made her blood freeze. "Take my place." She jerked away from the wall as if it had burned her. "What do you mean?" 3 days later, Kenji arrived at the building after Mei failed to show up for work. The landlord opened 2A with his master key, revealing an apartment frozen in time. Her belongings sat undisturbed, her shoes neatly arranged by the door, her phone charging on the bedside table. But Mei was gone, as if she had simply evaporated into the stale air of the narrow hallways. The police investigation found no signs of forced entry, no evidence of struggle, no indication that anyone else had been in the apartment. The only anomaly was the wall that separated 2A from the vacant unit next door. Deep scratch marks scarred the surface from the inside, gouged so deeply they reached the concrete beneath. When investigators finally opened the sealed unit 2B, they found nothing but dust, peeling wallpaper, and a smell like old earth. But pressed into the shared wall, clear as a photograph, was the impression of 2 human figures, one larger, one smaller, both outlined in the damp plaster, as if they had been pushing against it for years, trying to break through to the other side. Mei Kobayashi's case remains open but inactive. The building still stands on that narrow street in Kawasaki, and Unit 2A has been rented 4 times since her disappearance. Each tenant reports the same thing. At exactly 2:41 in the morning, 3 soft knocks echo from inside the wall. And sometimes, if you listen carefully, you can hear voices whispering from somewhere deep within the structure, calling out names that don't belong to anyone living. The knocking never stops. It just finds new people to answer it.